Our third speaker is Will Chandler, who's an independent curator and the proprietor of Chandler Art, the Chandler Art Advising Services. To most of us at the museum, he's better known as the former curator of decorative arts. When I have a question about the institution's history, Will is my guy to go to. Not only does he know about everything that's ever happened here, but he has the for me, delightful quality of not pulling punches when he tells stories about the museum's past. As we began talking about the exhibition, and we decided that it would be great if we could hang one of our own tapestries either in the upstairs galleries or in a space adjacent to the exhibition, Will was the person who said, well, the one that is best preserved, best quality, and also of an opposite subject matter to the Pastrana Tapestries is this tapestry of the scene of pillage from the Second Art of War series, which he oversaw the conservation of back in 1986. We talked about having what he described as Uncle Will's fireside chat about that tapestry at some point, and that discussion has now grown into the paper you're about to hear, which will look at our tapestry, but also, I think, give a very useful context for tapestries in general and how these things were used and how they are misused, repaired, treated, passed down over time. And tie in the local collection to the exhibition that we have as well. So with that, please welcome Will Chandler.
Some of you will remember this tapestry. This is the San Diego Pillage Tapestry, which was last seen here on the walls until this exhibition. It came down in 1986. It had been up for 3 or 4 years previous to that after an extensive conservation that took place for about 18 months. The tapestry was conserved for its rehanging by Stanley Durelian, who was the second generation tapestry conservator in Santa Cruz. His father, Dave Durelian, was himself a third generation Armenian carpet restorer who then in 1922 came out of Turkey and went first to France and then worked for French and Company in New York. And ultimately, after World War II, was the conservator who worked for 4 years getting raw latex off the back of the artable carpet that belonged to J. Paul Getty, which is now still in Los Angeles. So what was our tapestry when it came here? This came to us in 1926, and it was the gift of Appleton S. Bridges and his wife Amelia Timken Bridges. The Bridges were also notable for giving us our building, designed by William Templeton Johnson, the center wing of the museum now. And initially, they were art collectors. They were very involved in the art community here and in New York. They initially gave us a set of 4 other tapestries, Brussels tapestries of the 16th century. Those are still in the museum. 2 of them were actually conserved by Dave Durelian, my friend Stan's father, which is when I first met them at the end of the 70s, so we could rehang them in their original locations in the stairwell. And I didn't actually realize until this archival photograph was found that when the Pillage Tapestry came to the museum in April of 1926, ultimately it also hung in one of those positions in the stairwell. This particular photograph is probably 1931. It can't be any sooner than that because that's when we got the Albert Genovine Art Deco sculpture that's on the pedestal there. Now, in the 1927 museum catalog, I realize now that I look at this that you're not going to be able to read this from where you are. Maybe you can. But there is a Farrago of misinformation here. this is an important thing about tapestry. They're so hard to research, and not a lot was known. There was, after the French Revolution and other cultural changes, the tapestries all got put away. They got forgotten, and then when culture, an interest in history and this kind of culture was being revived after the 1860s, and they started being collected and brought out again, and people started trying to figure out what they were. They came up with these really wonderful stories. It's sort of as if Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson did the entire American Revolution. So you had a lot of tapestries, and you had very few names, and everyone had, especially in this country and in the nouveau riche world of the Gilded Age in the 19th century, you had a lot of people who wanted everything to be significant in terms that they already understood. So the 4 Flemish tapestries that were given by the Bridges in 1925 were listed as the arrival of the Queen of Sheba, Judith, and the head of Holofernes, the presentation of gifts to King Solomon, and a tapestry of Saul and David. That is all absolutely incorrect. They are actually 4 tapestries of a coherent scene, and which was only discovered decades later as there were more scholarship, and many more people were looking at these and beginning to recodify and go back into the actual records. There are actually 4 tapestries, many sets of which were woven in the 16th century, of the story of an almost mythical classical king, Cyrus the Persian. And although they're all in the same sort of fancy dress of sort of biblical and something in between Gothic and Roman and biblical in the costuming. So we then come to the Pillage Tapestry, which was listed then, and of course it was woven in Brussels about 1710. It was listed and believed in 1926 to be French. It was believed to be a Gobelins tapestry, which here and consistently was spelled Gobelin, not Gobelins. I like to think they called it the Goblin Tapestry, honestly. And here's the original description, which came from the dealer that it was purchased from. One of a series of 6 commissioned by Louis XIV to establish Les Gobelins de Paris in 1661. It represents the French general plundering Pfalz, over which Kurfürst Friedrich was in charge, brilliantly representative of the 17th century with its classic and Baroque grandeur, that it is. Designed by Anton Franz van der Meulen and woven by van der Oos, which is also incorrect. And it doesn't. Louis XVI is not on the horse in the center of the tapestry. I'm sorry. This is, of course, the cover from the museum archives. So, what was it really? It stayed the Goblin Tapestry for decades. But before, when the museum shut down at the beginning of World War II, so that some of you may not know that all of the Central Mesa buildings in Balboa Park became a temporary hospital for the U.S. Navy for the war in the Pacific. And the San Diego Museum moved over to very small quarters in a mansion over in Mission Hills called the Sunset Gallery. And a lot of things got put away, and then they weren't seen again until they came out decades later, and the tapestry was one of them. But we now know what this tapestry is, more or less. But I have to say that I'm going to have to lead you very quickly through a very complicated story, because a lot of these Art of War tapestries were woven. There were at least 2 main different sets of designs that were used, and actually there were variations on those that take it up to half a dozen. There are probably, out of the 2 design series, there are probably about 40 individual tapestries that survive, some of them individually, like ours here at San Diego, and others in groups. The first set and the first Art of War series, and this is Pillage from the first Art of War series, was woven for the Elector Maximilian Emmanuel of Bavaria in 1696, and probably by a Belgian master weaver named Lambert. It was designed by Lambert de Hont, a Dutch painter working in the Belgian tapestry industry, which was an industry. And so this is one of the scenes. And it has to be said that the original series, which was about 8 designs, all showing different sort of generic scenes of war. These are not historically representative as the Pastrana Tapestries were. They are more like genre paintings. They're describing typical things that you would see in the glory of war, and war being the sport of kings, not horse racing in the 17th century, and commissioning tapestries. But these were much more violent scenes than we see in the Second Art of War series. So here's a scene of pillage, which is a little hard to make out in the black and white. These black and white illustrations that I have all come from the first major piece of scholarship that was done on this series by a curator in England named Alan Wace, who studied them and tried to codify them and track down as many as he could in the 1930s. His research was not published until after his death in 1967 by the Victorian Albert. The reason they were working on that was that the next set of, after the Max Emmanuel set, were woven for John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, for Blenheim Palace. And this is a color example of actually one of the other duplicates from that second group of the first Art of War series. It's a little clearer to see. So in the pillage scene here, you see people are being brutalized. Here's an officer who's coming in, who's caning a woman and knocking everyone to the ground. They're killing people. It's a bad day in Flanders. Now, there is Max Emmanuel, the Elector of Bavaria, on the left, in his armor, being the perfect prince. And this was probably painted in the 1690s by a French artist. And here is John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, in his armor and looking very grand, painted by Joff, and wearing pseudo-medieval armor. He's wearing a knight's helmet that you'd wear for tournament jousting. And it's really costume play for them. Just about the time the Pastrana Tapestries were created, and the armor that's depicted in them was both useful and functional, and they wore it to survive in battle. But just about the time those tapestries were designed, the armor was becoming useless because firearms were coming into the story. And so by the time we get to the end of the 17th century, a great prince whose duty is to be magnificent. It is the duty of the prince to be magnificent, and also his duty to allow himself to be served. So there's always this sort of expression that's hearkening back to this 1,000-year tradition of knighthood and honor, and they're always aligning themselves to the legacy of the past. I think I started to say that's Geoffrey Kneller's full-length portrait of the Duke of Marlborough, painted in 1700. And there's Blenheim Palace. Churchill was made the first Duke of Marlborough by Queen Anne, and was the commander-in-chief of British forces during her reign. And there was a lot going on. This was just, and here is actually one of the Duke of Marlborough's tapestries from a second series that was woven for him in Brussels, hanging in the second stateroom in Blenheim Palace. I included this because I wanted to give you an idea of a sense of scale for these tapestries when they were being used in their original context. These are not like the Pastrana tapestries in their usage. They're smaller because the rooms are smaller. There were not specific spaces that were made for them. Unlike medieval tapestries, which tended to be moved around from palace to palace and chateau to chateau, or even hung outside, they would use them to line the streets for wedding processions sometimes, or they would make an environment a textile environment even for tournaments. They'd hang them up on fences. Instead, they're becoming more like frescoes. They're portable frescoes that can be changed out, because the whole concept of what a tapestry is changing from the medieval world, where they were purely textile creation, to, as the importance of the painter, as John was mentioning earlier, the importance of the painter drew people into looking at them in a different way and thinking about them in different ways. So they're in a hybrid state at this point. But an important thing about the composition of tapestries in this period is borne out when you can see the console here in front and the chairs and get a sense of human scale, is that, and then you have these very tall ceilings in these rooms. And these tapestries tend to be 12 and 13 feet high in this particular series. The main interest is in the foreground, where you have all the big figures, and this is what you study in advance. You can't quite see it here, I think, in this example, but up above in here, you have armies marching back and forth in the field. So when you're in the room and experiencing these, which you'll see in the Pillage Tapestry here in the exhibition, there's a lot going on in the background, which brings other levels of interest into the piece. Now, in all of the scholarship that's been done over the past 50 or now 70, 80 years on the Art of War series, there's a figure that sort of keeps coming into the conversation and then leaving it because it's so difficult to study these things. They're widely scattered. There's not a lot of scholarship known. Some of the most unique pieces, which includes the San Diego example, are hard to get to. And so there's a name that entered the conversation about 30 years ago with a researcher, but then that research was not picked up by the new generation, and he sort of left the story again. So I'm hoping in the next couple of years here we can reintroduce, because I believe he had a very central part in this story, and there's a lot of documentary evidence that I'm not going to bother you with today for the amount of time it takes. And that is Prince Eugene of Savoy. Eugen of Savoy, since he worked for the Holy Roman Empire. He was originally, of an Italian family, but he was born in Paris. He was raised in the court of Louis XIV. He was born in 1663 and lived until 1736. And so he had a long life, but he spent most of that in the service of the Habsburg. He served 3 Habsburg emperors in Vienna. And he originally, as a young man, he was not terribly healthy, and he was rather slight. And Louis XIV turned him down cold when, as a teenager, he said, "I want to become a soldier." He said, "Oh, no, this is silly. We'll make a priest out of you." He was deeply insulted. He was very proud, and he went huffing off to Vienna, and he became one of the great generals of his generation. He was a brilliant tactician. By the time the war with Louis XIV comes along in 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession, and a grand alliance against, I'll go into that more in a minute. Eugene of Savoy was already a very seasoned general. He had lifted the siege of Vienna by the Ottoman Turks in the 1680s, and something he would then do again after the War of the Spanish Succession. He went on and eventually drove the Turks back down into, in 1717, drove them back down toward Asian Turkey, with the battle in Belgrade in 1717. So he was, on top of which, and actually that's what we see here. This is a full-length portrait of him that was done as the conqueror of the Turks. And so here he is being magnificent, and he's riding over all of these Turkish troops, looked on adoringly by the Catholic angels of the Holy Roman Empire. And as this is actually sort of continuation of the Pastrana tradition, at sort of the founding level of that tradition, you see that continuing 250 years later to be expressed in what we now think of as sort of cringe-making, chauvinism. But at the time, yes, this is part of the duty to be magnificent, and he's doing a good job of it. Now, the building there is his winter palace in Vienna, which is now and has been actually since the middle of the 18th century, is the Austrian Ministry of Finance. Eugene of Savoy was a very successful general, and he was very rewarded by the grateful Habsburg emperors with a great deal of real estate up and down the empire, which was very lucrative. He was a very rich man. He was probably the leading non-king art patron of his generation. He founded a huge library. He had a court painter, Jan van Hoogtenberg, who was recording all of his battles. He had librarians. He had a huge intellectual. In the whole time he's leading armies, he still has this voluminous correspondence going on with people like Voltaire and the other leading intellectual thinkers of the day. And I believe, and there's reason to believe in the documentation, that as this great art patron, it was he who commissioned the designs for the Second Art of War series in 1710. These tapestries were commissioned for him and by John Churchill to celebrate their victories at the Battle of Blenheim and other battles in the War of Spanish Succession against the armies of Louis XIV. It was the first time in over 50 years that the French armies had been beaten by anyone, and this was a very big deal, and they celebrated accordingly. So, this is Pillage from the Second Art of War series. Now remember, you see over on the right there, we've got a scene of a Cossack, a Hungarian Cossack, which we know by his fur hat, who's a mercenary, who's stealing a bolt of cloth from this woman who's trying to keep it as they're looting this inn. As another maid from the inn runs off. But the point of the matter is that he's not knifing her in this. This is a much more gentle kind of depiction of what's going on, which is actually part of the reasons we think that Eugene of Savoy had something to do with it, because of all the generals in the Grand Alliance of his generation, he was considered to be the most humane. And he regularly stopped his troops from gratuitously burning cities that they might want to make friends with later, so on and so forth. But at the same time, this is how the army pays itself. And so the livestock are being driven off from this town. The church tower at the top, by the way, identifies this town as Hoogstad, which is near Blenheim. And then you have a whole bunch of scenes going on in here. One of the influences on these big tapestries at this time is that you can divide this into several groups of scenes that are related in the overall vision. This is sort of like a snapshot of something going on in a crowd, like a parade, a shot of a parade crowd. Everyone's doing their own thing. So here we have a man driving off all the livestock from the farm because the army is going to have them for dinner later. And so this is a discrete group that forms its own interest in the foreground when you're standing there in the room and looking at this. And then you have this center group, which is a more dramatic scene. We have a couple of officers up there on horseback, and they're press ganging. They've taken these two men captive. They're probably pressing them into service into the army. At the Battle of Blenheim, they lost 35,000 men, and so they would simply press gang all the available males of the right age and make them soldiers. And so here's the man's wife on her knees begging for her husband, who looks very unhappy about the whole thing. But again, they're not being beaten to the ground as they are actually in the other Pillage Tapestry. And then we have again this dramatic vignette of the bolt of cloth being taken away. But then in the middle distance, we've got these other scenes. Now these are genre tapestries, and they were very much, there was at the end of the 17th century, there arose, in Dutch painting in particular, there arose an interest in these sort of slice of life scenes of village life. The leading proponent of this school was named David Teniers. And we talk about, there's a whole school of Teniers tapestries that show village life scenes of people dancing around maypoles. And you sort of hear oompa music when you see some of those. So there's this other level of these sort of little story moments that are happening in the second tier, in the draw you into the middle distance. And here we have soldiers that are bringing things out of the storehouse. They're looting all the pewter plates out of a trunk. And they're not meant to look cute while they're doing it. They're meant to look like, ugly lumpenprolla soldiers. And then we get into the far distance in the background, in the upper reaches of the tapestry, and we have the army going away with all their spoils. And here we have a couple of characters down here by the water who are, what did you get? Well, I got a watch. Well, I got these gold coins. Or something like that. They're story scenes. And here in the center, we have another inn. You see there's the sign for the inn, this stone building with a thatched roof, and an archway to a corral. The horses are, somebody's coach horses are being stolen and taken out. They're breaking down the door so they can get those pewter plates, so on and so forth. And in the background, here we have the church tower at Hoogstad, and we have other buildings that have been put to the torch. War is hell. So, from the initial impression, we have a lot going on with this thing. And it's designed to be interesting in a variety of ways. As John mentioned earlier, these were things that you lived with in a domestic environment, and they stood the test. They stood the test of time. You wanted to be able to come back to it and look at it again and again and again and point out and tell stories. That had actually been part of the old tradition. In the medieval tradition, when tapestries were being designed, you didn't just have the painter. You also had, in that team, that design team, you had usually a historian who would write a script. And especially if you're doing something like the Trojan Wars, which we see in the Duke of Berry's tapestries, there would be an official story, and then the details, then the historian would work with the painter designing the tapestry, so you get all the details, hopefully, right. And of course, you're going back and forth with your patron who says, no, I want it to be this way, not that way. And it's very much of an industrial production. It really is a bit like Hollywood. Because you've got an enormous number of people working and an enormous budget and a lot of specialists, and they're coming together and they're having to please a client or the investor from New York, kind of thing. Well, what were the other tapestries in the set? There's about, in a full set of Art of War tapestries, there's usually about 8 scenes of these, each of which has all of these story elements in it. And I'm drawing these from another second Art of War set that was ironically done for Emperor Max Emmanuel also, about 1718, and that's still in the new palace in Schleißheim. And it's the most complete intact set we have. Now, it's got these trophy borders, as the others has. So this scene is called Encampment. This is the army is settled down for the night, so we've got tents, we've got people coming and going. Here a general has come up, and so one of the camp followers is rushing out to give him a glass of wine, and here they've got a wine barrel that they're serving, and it's a rather genial scene. Faschenade, this is not a term many of us are familiar with. What they're doing here is they're cutting shrubbery, and they're forming big bundles of it, and they use this when they're crossing rivers, they use the fascines to put down in the mud so you don't lose your wagons and your horses into a big mud hole. They're essentially consolidating a river crossing and so this was a very common activity for an army on the move. And then we have foraging, foragement, in which you have your army is traveling with horses and mules, and so here they're liberating a farmer's wheat field. So they have forage for their animals. Here's Max Emmanuel's Pillage, and I'll come back to this because we have slightly different details in the background and in the architecture in this tapestry. These cartoons were made up in sections, and sometimes sections, as the years passed and more sets were woven, you'll find those things changing. Here's La Marche, which shows a party of the officers all traveling together, and then the troops are all in the background. And an ambush, here the baggage train and the troops are being fired on by the other side have snuck up in a surprise attack out of the woods. We hate it when that happens. And La Halte, here's the end of the march, and they're going to get ready for another encampment. Now, interestingly, Max Emmanuel's set also had this tapestry. It's a scene of a battle at sea, sea fight, which is not, I don't think it's unique, but it's the least common. It was probably designed not as part of the original series. But that gives you an idea of what a typical set might consist of. And bringing us back home, the other tapestries we've seen here have these trophy borders that you see, and this is they're thematic groups of objects that express, what an army might bring away. You'll have banners that were captured from the other side. You'll have arms. You'll have all sorts of a garage sale of things in these trophy borders. But we have a picture frame border in San Diego. Now, this is the interesting thing. The picture frame border is not original to our tapestry. All of these areas, this trophy up here and the trophy at the bottom in the center, were rewoven. The original borders were trophy borders, but then these picture frame borders with what appear to be gilt wood, the woven tapestry gilt wood, the original borders were probably cut off in the second half of the 19th century, and these new borders were woven and they were sewn in. The trophy borders were twice as wide, so maybe the tapestry was sold to someone who had a lower ceiling. They didn't have 16-foot ceilings, they only had 14-foot ceilings. So that was one reason to take them down. Also, after about 1720, the trophy borders went out of fashion, and the French-style picture frame borders were considered more appropriate. So unfortunately, we're missing our original trophy border. The quality of the weaving is late, and the texture is late 19th century. It's probably Aubusson, and relative to the character of the original weaving, I have to say it's damn dull. And also, when you look on the back, we can get in. Here's a close-up on the left showing the face, and you can see all of this paler area is where the original was cut out, and the newly woven piece was pieced in. And here on the back, in a deeper close-up, you see those little spiky blue-green leaves up there. Here they are on the back side, unfaded, where they're still their perfect green. But you see this tufts of fringe here. This is actually the cut warps from the original tapestry and the newly woven pieces that are tufting up together on the back side. This is also what the weaver sees. The weaver, when they're weaving these on a low warp boom, they're working from the back side because they've got all these loose bobbins and loose ends. And so the face the display face that we look at is actually facing away from the weaver when they're weaving these. And just for ducks, because we got in behind the full linen lining to get some details, I included a couple of more details of that. Here's one of the hogs that's being driven away to be eaten, snuffling out from behind the linen lining on the back. But I included this to show you the beautiful green color. Green, these are vegetal dyes, and there is no natural green dye. And to make green in this tapestry, wool dyeing and silk dyeing tradition, you have to dye something blue and then over-dye it yellow to make a dark green, or you dye it yellow and over-dye it blue to make a light green. And since the second dye bath doesn't have as many chemical molecular places to fix into the fiber as well When they start to fade, they fade back in either toward yellow or toward blue. So when you see them on the backside, you see how naturalistically and beautifully green they originally were. And on the face, you can see the difference. There's the green, and here's the same detail on the face. It's just that much bluer. And then down under the woman who's having her yardage stolen, there's the water jug fallen over next to her into that beautiful green grasses, and here they're beautiful blue-green grasses. This tapestry is actually relatively unfaded. In that respect, it's not in bad condition, but it is changed. Now, after Alan Weiss did his big study in the 1930s, and then it was published in '67, his successor at the Victorian Albert, Wendy Hefford, who I'm happy to say is still with us in retirement, did another study of the Marlborough tapestries, and scholarship was being extended in the 1970s. In 1975, she wrote an article for a journal called Some Problems with the Marlborough Tapestries of interpretation, raising some questions. And in answer to that article, a private scholar in Germany named Walter Schott, who had recently discovered another Pillage tapestry, the one on the left there. This is just the center scene, but look, it's got its original trophy border. Now this one was woven, they just used the center third of the cartoon because maybe it was going in between two windows or a door and a window. They didn't need that much for this particular edition of it. But it has precisely the same cartoon and precisely the same wools because they faded in a certain way that's very characteristic, that is in common between the San Diego and we call this the Stuttgart because it was purchased at auction in 1980 in Stuttgart. And it's since gone, I don't know where again. This is part of the problem of researching these. But they're very close. They were probably woven at the same time. And so you can see, and on the upper right, you can see the picture frame faux giltwood border that is the replacement border on the San Diego tapestry. And this was probably this, pail of onions and a sack of plates and so on and so forth is part of the trophy design for the Pillage tapestry that ours also probably originally had. And the mound of that actually sort of matches the mound of the replaced area. And here we can see how precisely the two designs match. There's also, although they're a slightly different scale in these images, there's also a very interesting feature. You see the fading on this man's red jacket? It's faded in an unnatural way. Originally, when I just had the one tapestry to look at, I thought this was a bad repair that had faded. But then along comes the Stuttgart tapestry, and it's faded in exactly the same place, shot for shot in the cartoon. So this is an unusual example, I believe, of a bad dye lot from the original weaver, Judicus de Vos. By 1710, when these were done, they were starting to experiment more. The wonderful color preservation of the ancient tapestries happens because they had such a conservative dye tradition. But by 1710, they're starting to get cochineal and logwood from Brazil and Mexico to make other kinds of reds and purples. And they may not have really been up yet on how to fix them properly. So it turns out, and this is not the only place this occurs. It happens in several places on both tapestries. So I'm thinking that this actually, because we've got two just alike, I'm thinking that this is actually an original fade, not a repair. Now, why I'm leading you through this, because this takes us back. This is the Duke of Marlborough's encampment tapestry, which is smaller. This is the one in Blenheim Palace, and it's got these trophies up on the left. And right there is a dispatch case that's hanging. This is what a messenger would take, between the generals. And it's got a monogram on it, and the monogram is the conjoined monogram and here it is on the Stuttgart tapestry, the identical cartoon, the identical weaving, the identical monogram, different foliage in the trees, never mind that. But what this monogram is a combination of the Duke of Marlborough and Eugene of Savoy's monograms. You've got, in here, you've got the crossed S's down here for Savoy, making these swooping S's. And then the rest of it is an M for Marlborough and a J and a C, all conjoined, for John Churchill Marlborough. And there is some historical evidence that suggests that Eugene of Savoy, the great art patron, lent his court painter Jan van Hoogtenberg to interact with John Churchill on some of the designs for some of his tapestries, at least, if not all of them, when they were being woven at about the same time. So here's the evidence. We lost our border, but our border probably was the same border that we find on this tapestry. And another reason for me to think that, as opposed to, say, the later sets that were done about 1718 for Electra Max, and there's half a dozen other sets, Augustus the Strong and Poland got a set, is that the cartoon in the background on ours, that the inn that I showed you earlier, where they're breaking down the door of the inn and leading the horses out, look at the architecture with this big building in both. It's identical in both. But in the other tapestries that were woven later, you've got a completely different set of buildings in that location. It's a modified cartoon that only starts showing up about 1718. Since we know the Duke of Marlborough's Campment tapestry was woven about 1710, we have it and the Stuttgart tapestry, which just matches our cartoon, but also has the same monogram. It's very easy to reason, since they're all woven by Eutychus de Vos, and we know that, our tapestry is in that earlier group from about 1710. And again, there's other details. This is the later 1718 set for Max Emmanuel. It's got the different buildings in the center and even a different tree in the center. You see, there's the comparison. This is ours on the right. You see even the drawing of the tree and the buildings in the background are different. Max Emmanuel's set we know is done about 1718, 1724. Ours has simply slipped through the cracks. It's not even in the conversation at the moment for the leading scholarship on this. But this and the mysterious Stuttgart tapestry are that earlier set of cartoons, and that ties it all to Eugene of Savoy. Which leads me to the interesting possibility, which is going to take a few years to confirm, that since we have the largest weaving of that earliest generation of the Second Art of War series, it's entirely possible that this is the one that was commissioned for Eugene of Savoy for the Winter Palace. And I will not say that's my conclusion, but that's the question that we're holding open right now. So thank you very much.
We've I hope not exhausted your patience, although we have gone slightly over schedule. Rather than waste time pulling out chairs and setting up a table and all of that, I'm going to ask Barbara and Will just to join me standing here on stage, and if you have, we'll answer a few questions from the audience, and then we'll also stay around for a few minutes after that if a few more want to come. But first, any questions? Yes.
How did the tapestry get to Pastrana? How and why? Why because Spain? Okay.
Here.
This is the very last thing.
Okay.
It might help visually. John II's successor was Manuel I, his cousin.
Wait, I think you need the microphone here.
Oh. John II's successor was Manuel I, and Manuel basically became. Is there a advance? Sorry about that. Oh.
Greg, can you turn the projector back on?
Here. Sorry about that. See, I skipped quite a bit. Manuel I inherited the throne,
And what happened was he married, remember the couple of the Evora wedding? Prince Juan died in a horseback riding accident about 6 months after the marriage. They were riding along the beach, two men holding each other's arms, and the horses stumbled, and the young prince died. And Emmanuel I, when he became king of Portugal, offered to marry the widowed Infanta Isabel. And so, through negotiations with the Catholic monarchs Isabel and Ferdinand, what happened was the marriage went through around 1497. Now, simultaneously, Isabel and Ferdinand lost their only son, Prince Juan. And so what this meant was this marriage between Emmanuel and Isabel would that eventually Emmanuel, his son, would inherit the throne of Spain and Portugal, the united Iberian Peninsula. Well, when Emmanuel visited Spain in 1498, he brought with him 600 knights and numerous works in ivory, olifants and salt cellars, which were ceremonial in nature, and he gave them as presents to the Spanish noblemen of the Spanish court, and even the king and queen. And I think it was during this time that he gave the Pastrana Tapestries. And eventually, there's Infanta Isabella, just as a reminder, and Prince Juan, who dies. But these tapestries were then entered into the collection of what would become the family that will donate them to the Pastrana Church. The Infantado Palace is where they entertained Emmanuel and Isabel, and they were there to get the oaths of allegiance from the Spanish courts. And they visited again in 1498. And I think that's when he gave the tapestries. Now, these tapestries find their way into the Mendoza family, and they are inventoried in the collection of the Mendoza family in 1532. So we know that they had to have entered Spain, at least by 1532, because 6 tapestries are recorded, the 4 that are in the exhibit and the 2 that I showed you that have yet to be restored. And this is just a view of this palace that the inventory of Inigo Lopez de Mendoza, it entered his collection. And from that point on, it stays within the family and then is transported to or given to the church, the parochial church in Pastrana. And that's really what I think happens. There are all sorts of theories, but you know, an inventory doesn't lie. That's like a last will and testament. And so I think one has to take, the only person who could have given them would have been Emmanuel, who had no love for John II, since John II killed his brother. But he also wanted to be king of Spain. Okay, that's what I think happened.
I think that's probably as good a place as any to end today. As I said, we'll...
I took a bit of time.
No. But I know that people have lunch reservations and things like that. So we'll stick around. If you have any more questions, please come up and talk to us. But thank you all for coming and enjoy the exhibition.